All right, let's go ahead and now continue with the third part of chapter 6. I'll go ahead and show the slides. So the Heckscher-Ohlin theory, this talks about comparative advantage and how it reflects differences in national factor endowments. The extent to which a country is endowed with resources such as land, labor, and capital. So people like this theory because it has common sense appeal. It makes sense that, yeah, if they have a lot of land, if they have a lot of talented labor, if they have money, if they have capital, then a country should be able to move forward with production. So they can export goods that make intensive use of factors that are locally abundant. And they can import the goods that make intensive use of factors that are locally scarce. It makes it there makes few simplifying assumptions over the Ricardo's theory. As I said, that the Ricardo's theory had all these different assumptions that were somewhat hard to get over. And so that's why this Heckscher-Ohlin theory is very well liked. But we're going to move on to the next slide here, the Leontief paradox. That in 1953, this economist Leontief said that since the U.S. is relatively abundant in capital, it would export capital-intensive goods and import labor-intensive goods. But U.S. exports were less capital-intensive than U.S. imports. And so nobody really knows why there's this paradox, why the Heckscher-Ohlin theory doesn't naturally play out. But there's some possible explanations include that the U.S. has a special advantage in producing products made with innovative technology that are less capital intensive. So it's kind of like an exception because of the type of products that we import and export. And that the differences in technology lead to differences in productivity, which then drives trade patterns. And so again, that it's very particular to the type of products that the United States is importing and exporting. And as I said, no one's really sure why we see this paradox, even though obviously many economists have looked at it. But economists still like the Heckscher-Ohlin model, but it's a poor predictor, unfortunately, of trade patterns because of this paradox. The Ricardo model predicts with greater accuracy. Now we're going to talk a little bit about product life cycle theory. This is by an economist named Vernon, and that around that same time as the previous paradox that we were talking about in the 1960s. As you can see, a lot of these things started showing up in the 1960s. After World War II was over, people were going back to normal. They spent about 10, 15 years getting business back, and now they're able to come up with some theories as to why certain countries did better over others, and how we could potentially predict which products certain countries should specialize in to help their GDP. So Vernon said that they produced a product life cycle theory based on ideas that for most of the 20th century, the majority of new products were produced and sold in the US market. So interesting, right? Because that's not the case necessarily now. We have products developed throughout the world, as we'll talk about in this slide and following slides. But in the 1960s, most new products, right, were produced and sold in the US. If you think back to your grandparents or when my parents moved to the United States in the 50s, it was because it was a really exciting time to be here. New products, new production, lots of people to sell things to, etc. At the time, the wealth and the size of the U.S. market gave a strong incentive for U.S. firms to produce new products, right? That's exactly what happened to my family. My grandparents had a Swiss watch company, and they were doing very well throughout Europe. It's very well known in Europe. And they thought, oh my gosh, the US market is such a huge opportunity. We're going to open up an American subsidiary. And that's exactly why my dad moved to the United States when he was 6 years old. So as products mature, both in local and in location of sales and optimal production, location will change, affecting flow and direction of trade. So this is the idea that once they have like a smooth production and the product is somewhat set or finalized, then they feel a little bit more comfortable potentially moving that production offshore. Other countries are maybe able to do it. They move things at least in the 60s, 70s, they were moving things to Spain. Now we move things to Asia, etc. The product becomes standardized and the price becomes the main competitive weapon. So now, since many other people can produce it, there's less there's more competition as to who how many products are out there. So now they're trying to really get the price down, and that's why the benefit of moving it to offshore, to places where it's cheaper to produce. The U.S. switches from an exporter to an importer as production goes to lower cost foreign nations. And then a second slide here on the product life cycle theory, but now in the 21st century. So here we say that it might not be as relevant today, because now, as we said, I briefly alluded to on the last slide, many products now actually are introduced in Japan or South Korea, as we see with the engineers and the innovation that's happening in those countries. Especially South Korea just has blossomed when it comes to electronics. And then many new products are introduced simultaneously into US, Europe, and Asia. And I think that for me personally, again, this is really relevant because when I was a child, very often the US would get the product first, and then I'd go see my cousins in Switzerland and they wouldn't have certain products. But now, because of the internet and technology and marketing being cross borders, that we are able to introduce products throughout the world at the same time. And then production is often globally dispersed because people want to take advantage of that low cost from the beginning. And so, many engineers or entrepreneurs that I know, they don't necessarily go to produce in the United States initially. They will initially already go to China and Asia to get those low cost production costs. And so now we're moving on to what's called new trade theory, as opposed to product life cycle theory. New trade theory talks about how trade can increase a variety of goods available and decrease the average cost of goods. So this is talking about the idea of economies of scale, and you've probably already maybe studied this in your economics courses or other courses in your MBA. This is talking about how unit cost reductions associate with large scale output. So the more we're producing, the more efficiencies, and we can bring down the price. I think of Costco in this, right? If you buy more, it's because you're buying more and they can make more, and so we can make the unit cost lower. When output required to attain economies of scale represents a significant portion of total world demand, global market may only support a small number of firms. And the author of this textbook brings this up a few times because his specialty is that he talks a lot about the aerospace industry and how in aerospace we only have a handful of Boeing, Airbus, etc. That because we just don't need so many large planes. And so we'll talk more about that in the following slides. So yeah, wide body aircraft manufacturing is what he's talking about. So when we talk about increasing product variety, though, and reducing costs, without trade, as we've said, a small nation may not be able to support demand necessary for producers to realize required economies of scale. So certain products could not be produced, right? So a small nation like Switzerland or like Iceland or something like this, they couldn't produce so many different products, and they could never get to economies of scale because they have such a small population. So certain products then just wouldn't get reproduced and utilized. But with trade, right, that a nation may be able to specialize in producing a narrower range of products and then buy the goods that doesn't make from other countries. Each nation then simultaneously increases the variety of goods available. And the example that they give in the book is that one country might be good at making sports cars and another country might be good at making minivans. They don't have enough resources to create both. But then when they trade, they can each specialize in one thing, and then each country can have a variety of different products. Now, also new trade theory talks about first mover advantages and patterns of trade. So again, first mover advantages probably showed up in your strategy class, maybe in your economics class. This is the idea that there are economic and strategic advantages that accrue to early entrants in an industry. So the first person that makes the product might have an advantage. Firms develop economies of scale. They can make it, they're making it more, making it faster, getting more business, and then they create barriers potentially to entry for other firms that people can't necessarily enter the market. We see that with Apple, right? They got on this product pretty quickly. I mean, there were other companies making cell phones and computers ahead of them, but they got on the market where it was very sleek and very, organized and really geared toward the consumer. And now nobody really can compete with Apple anymore. The patterns of trade and world economy may result in a first mover advantages and economies of scale. So what this is saying that governments might get involved because they might want to encourage certain organizations to be the first mover, and then they will potentially financially support that company or in that industry. And again, this shows up in the aerospace industry with Airbus. They were the first to produce these super jumbo jets, and realize the economies of scale. And now they really have almost a monopoly on that, because as I said, the author says that we can only handle so many jumbo jets for the entire world. We only need so many jumbo jets for the entire world. And they were there first. What are the implications of new trade theory? So as I alluded to already, right, that the governments can get involved. So let's go through the bullet points and break this down. The nations may benefit from trade even when they do not differ in resource endowments of technology. So, right, so if they are even if they don't have the land and the resources, etc., if they are the first mover, they still can really benefit and get a lot of money from sale of these products. A country may predominate in export of goods because it was lucky enough to have one or more to be the first produce them. And then it doesn't really matter if they have the more resources or better resources than other countries. They were just the first. New trade theory is at variance with the Heckscher-Ohlin theory. That's different because if you remember, the Heckscher-Ohlin theory says that a country will succeed if it's well endowed, but the new trade theory says it doesn't matter if it's well endowed; they just have to be the first, as I just mentioned. New trade theory also is useful in explaining trade patterns, so we can see how countries have done well in the past. And we can also provide economic rationale for proactive trade policy that is at variance with other free trade theories. And what this is it generates support for government intervention, and how Boeing also had a lot of government intervention when they first started creating their jets. And so again, this is a policy that really encourages governments to get involved, to take advantage of this new trade theory. Let's now move on to the national competitive advantage, Porter's diamond. So back here to Porter from Harvard Business School. As I said, Michael Porter has had a lot of influence on trade theories, economies, etc., management theories as well. And here he talks about international trade. He believed that the existing theories of international trade only one part of the story. He has what we're going to see is called a diamond. So he thinks there are 4 parts to the story when it comes to how we can predict which organizations and countries do well when it comes to trade. He wanted to explain why a nation achieves international success in a particular industry. There are 4 attributes of a nation, not just 1 or 2, that shape the environment in which local firms compete, and how his main things are how chance, kind of not really luck, but being at the right time at the right place, and also how government can influence this national diamond is what he calls it. And one of the examples that I like in the book is it says, like, why does Switzerland excel in precision instruments and chemicals? And he's saying that it uses resources productively. Yes, but there's more to the story, right? Right, Heckscher-Ohlin would have said that it's due to the resources that Switzerland has, but Porter is saying, actually, there was more to it than that. So let's get into it and talk through it. So the next couple of slides, 4 slides, are going to talk about each of these different pieces of the diamond. You'll notice that they all are interchangeable. We're going to start first with factor endowments and talking about skilled labor and infrastructure. That's exactly what we were talking about in previous slides, other theories to speak to this. Then we're going to talk about demand conditions and how the home country has certain demands for these products. And, Switzerland, the pharmaceutical industry, is a result of them doing so well in creating dyes for the textile industry 200 years ago. And then they just moved those skills of the science of making dyes into the science of making pharmaceuticals, which is very similar. And it's because Switzerland is very close to France, and France was very well known for textiles, and the UK and other countries just weren't doing it as well. As we know, the Swiss are very good about precision. If you've ever been there, the trains aren't on time. Their culture is just built around making things that are very, very precise. Before I go down that rabbit hole, we're going to then talk about related and supporting industries. So that there's often a geographic cluster. So it wasn't just Switzerland, but it was Germany as well, as I said, and France that was needing these things, and even Italy. And then we're going to talk about firm, strategy, structure, and rivalry. And so again, coming back to the talents within the firm, making sure that they have a strong sense of strategy and a strong and capable management team. So let's go into these further in detail. So the first one, factor endowments. These are basic things like natural resources, climate, location, demographics, but it's also about communication infrastructure, skilled labor, research facilities, and technological know-how, which, as we've spoken about in this course a few times, are a result very often of the government and supporting education. So these are all considered factor endowments. Basic factors can provide initial advantages that are extended by investment in advanced factors. So maybe they have the climate, or they have the demographic, et cetera, but then there's as I just mentioned, investment in these advanced ones to move it forward faster. Advanced factors are most significant for competitive advantage. So again, this is the key, what Porter thinks, into helping a country and an organization move forward. And his example here is Japan. Not just, he mentioned Switzerland and Germany, yes, but he also mentions Japan and their large pool of engineers, and how they're moving forward very quickly because they have invested so much in developing engineers. They also have a lot of people that are interested in cameras. It's kind of a major hobby in Japan. And because of that, they've been a lot of innovation when it comes to camera models. The next one, the second part of the diamond, are demand conditions. And this is the nature of home demand for an industry's product or service. So again, what are they demanding at home for a potential product? They influence the development of capabilities. And sorry, I jumped ahead. So this is actually where Japan comes in with a lot of people interested in cameras as a hobby. So they were demanding this from their engineers. My notes jumped ahead too quickly. And this is also sophisticated and demanding customers pressure the firms to be more competitive and produce high quality, innovative products. So this is where he's saying that there are certain situations, certain countries that have these demands upon them. The third one is the related and supporting industries. And this is where I was talking about how Switzerland, Basel in particular, Basel is in that tri-state area. Half part of Basel is on the border of France, and part of Basel is on the border of Germany, but it's really in Switzerland. And so they were able to really jump into all these different countries when it came to dyes and the textile industry. It's a geographic cluster. There's a presence of suppliers and industries that are internationally competitive. Investing in these industries can spill over and contribute to successes in other industries. right? So it wasn't just pharmaceuticals, then it became high precision instruments and watches. Successful industries are grouped in clusters within countries, prompting knowledge flows between the firms. And the example here is Germany's textile and apparel sector that helped help spur this development 200 years ago. Let's move on to the fourth part of the diamond. Here we're talking about firm strategy, structure, and rivalry. And this is what I was talking about, making sure that there's talent to help set appropriate strategy and management. And that different nations are characterized by different management ideologies. And either they help or they don't help them build national competitive advantage. There's a strong association between vigorous domestic rivalry and creation and persistence of competitive advantage in industry. And we talked a little bit about this in previous chapters, how different nations have a culture that kind of helps competition or helps organizations move forward a little bit faster. Different religions have an influence. The Swiss, again, speaking from my personal experience, are mostly Protestant. And as we've spoken in previous chapters, there is a theory, right, that the Protestants are very driven, and then over the Catholics, that they have this natural drive to make money. So each different country has its own specialties, and that Porter believes that there is an aspect of strategy and rivalry that has an effect on how a country does and an organization does. And he also noted in the textbook that, not Porter, but the author noted that, Charles Hill, that actually US firms with leaders have mostly finance backgrounds, and that they have less of a focus on engineering as opposed to firms abroad. And that this is actually a lack and a gap, that firms in the US potentially are less focused on, at times, at innovation and really understanding how a product works. And that might be a fault of theirs. And that he's saying that companies that have engineers that are at the head of the organization might actually do a little bit better. It's a theory. So now evaluating Porter's theory. If Porter's correct, his model should predict pattern of international trade in real world, that countries should export products from industries where the diamond is favorable, and they should import products from areas where the diamond is not favorable, right? So again, coming back to Switzerland, the precision instruments, right? They can export pharmaceuticals, innovation in pharmaceuticals, they can export watches, etc. But they should then start to import things like clothing. They should import things like steel, etc. The fault with Porter's diamond is that there's little empirical testing of the theory. It's a newer theory. And what we come away with in this chapter, because it's the last slide of this chapter, is that each theory explains something about trade, right? And economists have their favorite theories. There's a lot of overlap with these theories. There's a lot of assumptions that come with these theories, but the idea is that there are theories, and the world is still working on what the perfect theory is. At the end of the day, it's really important to be aware of all the factors that go into all these theories when you start to evaluate where an organization and a country should head in the future. So I will let our classmates review the 360 review managerial implications. But obviously, they can talk about location, first mover advantages, government policy, etc., changes in government policy. The author loves to talk about Trump and his trade policy, etc. In this chapter, we have summarizing understood why nations trade. Why would nations trade with each other, right? Because at the end of the day, the theories have proven that everybody does better. We've summarized the different theories explaining trade flows between nations. As I said, there are a handful of different theories that are still being proven. We recognize why many economists believe that unrestricted free trade between nations will raise the economic welfare of countries that participate in a free trade system. And this is going back to those statistics about how countries that do trade freely which will much more quickly bring up their economies. We've explained the arguments of those who maintain that government can play a proactive role in promoting national competitive advantage in certain industries, especially right when it comes to first mover advantage. So the government supporting things like the aerospace industry have proven to be fruitful. And then the last thing is understood the important implications that international trade theory holds for business practices. And this is the idea that no trade theory is absolutely perfect, but there are many factors to consider and a lot of things that people have thought about, a lot of economists have worked through in the last couple of decades to talk about trade theory and how it can work for business. Okay, great. Thank you so much for joining me, and I will see you in chapter 7.